Welcome to PIMCO Pod. In this episode, we discuss behavioral insights to help enhance investors' decision-making processes. Stay tuned after the conclusion of the podcast for additional important information. The Behavioral Lens: Best Practices for Decision-Making Under Uncertainty by Anastasia Buyelskaya, Ph.D. Uncertainty is a key theme in 2025. See, for example, PIMCO's latest cyclical outlook, Uncertainty is Certain. And since we are still in January, meaning the collective appetite for reflection and improvement has not yet yielded to old habits, it may be a good time to review some best practices from a behavioral science perspective for decision-making under uncertainty. This piece was inspired by the 4 tenets of prospect theory, a landmark in behavioral science introduced by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979. Years later, Kahneman received the Nobel Prize for his work on judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. Kahneman passed away in 2024, an immense loss for the behavioral science community, but his insights remain powerful and relevant for navigating the uncertainty of 2025. The realm of probabilities. When it comes to macroeconomic forecasting, today's uncertainty implies investors are less comfortable predicting sure bets, events with nearly 0 to 100% probability. More situations may feel like 50-50 or 40-60. With more macro counterfactuals in play, investors might consider some best practices for navigating this realm of probabilities. Quantify uncertainty and focus on relative changes. As I wrote in the 30th of April 2024, Macro Signposts, taking a more scientific approach can enhance forecasts. The precise language of probability, using numerical estimates, is important. It's harder to spot changes in the likelihood of different scenarios occurring if you describe them as being possible, a vague word that can mean 25% to one listener and 45% to another, instead of explicitly forecasting that the scenario is 25% likely to occur today and then updating that number later with new information. The relative changes versus absolute probability estimates will have the most information value. Assign probabilities before looking at stress tests. In a world of many possible scenarios, stress tests are more important than ever. Too often, however, investors analyze the results of stress tests without first estimating the probability of that scenario occurring. That's when the tail starts wagging the dog. If a portfolio looks really bad under the stress test, confirmation bias kicks in and investors are then likely to assign a low probability to that scenario or shrug it off altogether. By first asking the likelihood of that scenario occurring and only then analyzing the stress test, investors can think more critically about the potential impact on their portfolios. Losses loom large. Hundreds of studies have now shown that in general, people dislike losses about twice as much as they like gains. In a coin flip game where a wrong guess costs the player $100, the average person would want a correct guess to win roughly $200 to justify playing the game. There are individual differences, with some people more loss-tolerant, needing less than $200, and some more loss-averse, needing more than $200. But for investors navigating a world where uncertainty creates a lot of coin flip situations, the potential benefits of a positive scenario will typically need to significantly outweigh the potential losses of the corresponding negative scenario. Explicitly analyze drawdown risk and size positions accordingly. The unknown has a way of creating a much larger shadow than the reality and of consuming precious cognitive energy. Quantifying the worst-case scenario and explicitly considering this drawdown risk can make potential losses seem less frightening and more manageable. And if, when quantified, the drawdown risk is indeed too large, investors can resize their positions accordingly. Practice emotion regulation. There are beneficial evolutionary reasons why humans seem to experience more or more powerful negative emotions than positive ones. But sometimes the negative emotions work against us rather than for us. The fear of losing money activates the same fear center of the brain, the amygdala, that helps us flee or fight a charging bear, putting investors at risk of overreacting to financial loss. Emotion regulation is a practice that has been shown to help quiet this fear response and reduce the extent of loss aversion in decision-making. Know thyself. Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory says that people's risk-taking is predictable by the domain of gains or losses where they find themselves. That is, have they won or lost? Are their investments up or down? Most people are risk-averse in the domain of gains because they are more interested in crystallizing their existing gains than in making more money, and risk-seeking in the domain of losses because they are more interested in not crystallizing the existing losses and would rather risk losing even more for a chance at breaking even. But there are many different behavioral approaches to risk under different scenarios, and it's helpful to assess our own tendencies as investors as well as the tendencies of entire groups or markets. Identify your risk-taking style. Based on concepts of risk tolerance and the domains of gain or loss, we can identify several broad risk-taking styles investors may have. The prospect theory style outlined above includes investors who prefer to lock in gains but chase losses. Other investors, by contrast, become more risk-averse following losses, colloquially known as the snake bite effect, while others take more risk following gains, known as the house money effect. And some investors are consistent independent of how much money they have gained or lost, either consistently risk-averse or consistently risk-seeking. A bit of self-reflection along with a look at historical data on prior investment decisions can help reveal one's risk-taking style. Understand when it costs you. Your risk-taking style could be costing you money. Think about scenarios that led you to experience regret. Was it when you were up performance-wise in the domain of gains and decided to make a risky trade that didn't pan out? Perhaps your tendency toward the house money effect hurt you in this situation. If you find that you are making systematic mistakes linked to your risk-taking behavioral style, consider changes in your process that help remove or counter the inherent biases in that style. For example, perhaps stop yourself out for a while after hitting a high-performance target. Mind the reference point. What many economists find shocking about prospect theory is the suggestion that losses and gains are not always evaluated with respect to zero. Human psychology does not always interpret a positive number as a gain and a negative number as a loss. For example, if you win a cash prize but your rival wins an even larger cash prize, your net positive win may still feel like a loss. Recognize potential reference points. Since absolute numbers can be difficult to evaluate, humans naturally gravitate toward the relative numbers that gauge performance against set reference points. Pay careful attention to the data you review regularly, your reference points, and consider how they may be anchoring your expectations. Some reference points are obvious. Investors seek to outperform a risk-free rate and often a benchmark rate as well. But other data can creep into the foreground and re-anchor expectations. Competitor performance, a credit rating, a funds ranking, and so forth. How are those reference points serving you? Change your approach to the reference points that hinder your decision-making. An investor once told me that after many years of starting every single day by looking at whether his portfolios were up or down a few basis points, he finally stopped checking those numbers until later in the morning. At best, it had no information value, and at worst, I just felt bad about myself for the rest of the day, was the way he described it. Since reference points are how you determine whether you're in the domain of gains or domain of losses, however you define it, data can have the power to whipsaw you from one domain to the other, and depending on your risk style, this could harm your decision-making. You may be better off muting some data, or replacing it, or looking at it differently. Final thoughts. Consider an information diet. To build off the final insight above, there will be more information generated, circulated, and promoted than we really need to monitor. Just as with food, we may all live a little longer and better if we consume a bit less. Take some time to think about how the information you're exposed to influences your decision-making, and be especially aware of the kinds of data that may lead to less productive behavior or worse investment decisions. Perhaps 2025 is the year to add information diet to the list of New Year's resolutions. It's still January, so stay optimistic and use some behavioral best practices to navigate the coming year of uncertainty. Thank you for listening. That was The Behavioral Lens, Best Practices for Decision-Making Under Uncertainty. For future insights, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Macro Signpost highlights weekly takeaways from the data analysis conducted by our team of economists and other macro experts. For PIMCO's official views on the global economy, please visit PIMCO.com. The discussion and content provided within this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and may not be appropriate for all investors. Reliance upon information provided in a podcast is at the sole responsibility of the listener. The information included herein is not based on any particularized financial situation or need, and it is not intended to be and should not be construed as a forecast, research, investment advice, or a recommendation for any specific PIMCO or other security, strategy, product, or service. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Investors should speak to their financial advisors regarding the investment mix that may be right for them based on their financial situation and investment objective. Podcast may involve discussions with non-PIMCO personnel, and such content contain the current opinions of the speaker, but not necessarily those of PIMCO. Other podcasts may consist of audio recording of an existing PIMCO article, and such material contains the current opinions of the manager. The opinions expressed in all podcasts are subject to change without notice. Information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable but not guaranteed. PIMCO, as a general matter, provides services to qualified institutions, financial intermediaries, and institutional investors. This is not an offer to any person in any jurisdiction where unlawful or unauthorized. For additional important information, go to www.pimco.com/gbl/en/general/legal-pages/podcast-disclosures.